Okay, so this video is going to be a discussion both of the build I've been trying to make in this game and consequently what it has made me think about the way that damage over time effects work in Warhammer Martyr. So, for a little bit of background, my feeling about how a dot build should work based on other games and what you would expect is that you give up some upfront damage in return for backloaded damage that ramps. You give up some survivability because you aren't hitting as much or you're losing, on crit procs or things like that. You're probably more of a hit and run character and you might be more focused on debuffs. And when I first started making this character, I was like, all right, so let's look at what you have in the skills. We have damage over time tree. And these are pretty decent. Like, this is 5%. That's not bad. Like, these are, in terms of nodes that you can get, these are pretty decent ones. And you can see here that there are bonuses that reward you for going for both poison and burn and bleed. So I was like, all right, I'll do all three. So the first thing I thought about was you get free damage over time effects from heat crits and from physical crits if you have the Relic mod. So I was like, well, the way that it says dots work is they deal 20%, at least in this game, they deal 20% of the initial hit damage per tick. So I was like, okay, well, I can scale the initial hit through crit damage, and that will make it strong. The first problem is that it turns out damage over time effects in this game do not scale with crit at all. So the 20% per tick you get is a 20% of what the white damage hit would have been. Okay, that's fine. I was like, okay, so crits are off the table, and that's actually fine because that frees up some spot on my items. I don't need to get as much crits right, blah, blah, blah. So I was like, okay, can't go crits. Maybe I could go grinder. No, grinder causes other problems. What are the perks that you have that relate to dots? Well, there's enhanced attrition, 50% dot damage. That's pretty cool. And then other than that, the only dot-related perks you can get specifically are... there's one that is... Where are you? 0.3%. Oh yeah, this one. 3-second dot duration. This I don't really think is worth taking. I'll explain why later, but the short answer is that you can always refresh your dots if you need to. And it's very, very rare that I have the case where those extra 3 seconds would have mattered enormously. And the other one is, where are you? Somewhere in here, there's 0.3% heal every time your dots tick. This is completely useless, by the way. So for reference, I have 3.6k HP. This means every single dot tick I heal for roughly 10 health. So the standard problem is that for most trash mobs, if you have a correctly set up build, you one-shot them even on impossible, or you only tick once. So for reference, the amount of HP on hit you might get on a single item might be 10 HP on hit. So a single item roll gives you a better effect than this. And because your dots only tick once every second, and you can hit multiple enemies more than once a second, this is actually worse than HP on hit. That seems to me silly. You could do this other ways, but suffice it to say that's worthless. Other than that, there's nothing that specifically affects dot. But for example, this one here, 50% damage to skills. That damage to skills increases the upfront damage, which increases the concomitant dot. Okay. So given that dots on crit don't really work, and I can get my damage over time here, and here I was like, all right, there's this Relic Karma Mod. And this Relic Karma Mod says that your damage increases by 100% from 20% to 40% on skills with 5 seconds cooldown. This implies it's a base damage increase. That means you're literally doing twice as much. That's really cool. So I'll try focusing on that. Problem is I need a 5-second cooldown. And note that when it says dot type skill, this means skill specifically tagged with the damage over time property. And this means this excludes bonus dots from things like crits. By the way, just as a note, this node here, you get burns on 0 overheat, literally doesn't work. It applies a 0 damage burn effect, so they look like they're burning, but they take no damage. This is another possibility I considered. It does not work. The problem then becomes with this, well, one obvious thing that you could do would be to use this, right? So this, because dots scale off base damage rather than multiple hit damage, a really high base damage skill like this, Sniper Shot, which has 651 base damage, versus this, which has 345. These are two other damage over time skills on the Exodus. If I could get this to do damage over time effects, which I can, that would be cool. And if this distortion armor increased the base damage of the poison that I gained from this Sniper Shot by 40%, that would be huge. Problem is, even though this says it gains the dot poison tag, it doesn't gain the dot poison tag, or at least the damage caused by this doesn't increase. And what's worse, the multipliers that you get by shooting, for example, the head don't apply to the dots. So, for example, if I hit them for 1.2k white with this, the poison is only somewhere between 100 and 150. Whereas if I hit them with this for 200 white, the bleed that I get from it is about 120. So focusing on this poison here doesn't really seem to work. Okay, so I want to deal all three dot types. Because I guess that's the only other way of getting decent quantities of poison. I can't, because damage over time effects, you can only have one of any given type active. You can't just repeatedly add poison or repeatedly add fire, and we'll come back to why that's a problem in a moment. So I ended up going with the Needler. So I can use this, because this is damage over time tagged, dot poisoning, to make use of this. And the Exodus, because this gets a fire shot and a bleed shot. Alright, that's all well and good. How else can I scale this? Well, I can't scale it through crit damage. So I was like, alright, I'll scale it through stacking vulnerabilities. Now, this bestows random vulnerabilities. Over here on the skill tree, we have this, which is 3% extra damage at every point of stacked vulnerability, 1% damage bonus for each debilitating effect. You get slow from crits, and I get an extra vulnerability from crits. So using the left click on my Needler stacks vulnerabilities, crits, and extra damage really, really fast. Okay, here's a central mechanical problem with the way dots work. When you apply a dot in this game, it snapshots the damage of the damage over time effect at the moment that you actually apply the dot. So I'm going to quickly show you what I mean by this, but it's incredibly frustrating. All right, we'll do this. We'll ignore the mission. Because what it means is that I can't apply a bleed and a burn on a target and then stack vulnerability on them to make that bleed and that burn deal increasing damage over time. I have to stack the vulnerability first and then apply the bleed or burn. So it doesn't really ramp. And by the time you've stacked any vulnerability at all, the hit damage of your skills is so high that you usually only get 1 or 2 dot ticks after them anyway, so the damage over time is sort of moot. So where are we left with this? Well, does this build work? Yes, sort of. I can kill things on Impossible Tarot if I need to. What is the problem with it? I have absolutely no defensive mechanics whatsoever. I have almost no way of getting back health. I've sacrificed everything, including my armor relic slot, to deal extra dot damage.
Sensory stimuli link
But
has been established.
whatever.
Subject in severe
So
distress
let's talk about some of the problems.
Hostiles are attempting forced entry to the vault where subject is located.
Shut up.
Vault
So
integrity compromised.
one of the other problems that I was having originally is I was like, okay, well, these damage over time effects are being reduced by armor. They don't have armor penetration. But one of the nice things about the Exodus is this bleed has armor breaking. There is a problem, however. Damage over time effects in this game are affected by armor, even if the hit that dealt them is not. So what this means is the damage of both my Hellfire Shot and my Pervasive Shot, which have roughly similar damage, you know, they're off by 20%, but they'll deal pretty similar levels of damage over time effects on a Marine. This is extremely frustrating. So it means that against armored targets, this doesn't actually deal increased damage with its dot, even though it is an armor-breaking attack, which makes damage over time effects even worse than you might expect. All right, so let's use this Bull Ogrin as an example. All right, so if we look here, if I tag him with this bleed, you'll see the bleed is initially doing 130 per tick. Now I'm going to apply some vulnerabilities to him. How much is this bleed now doing? Not very much. It is not, in fact, improved at all. In fact, what's worse, the damage of damage over time effects seems to go down after I apply vulnerabilities of a different type. If I don't reapply the damage over time effect itself, it is really, really weird. If I can find another one. Oh yeah, by the way, I'm doing vulnerability stacking, right? So you might think I use hololithic armor. Well, here's a great thing. So the clones spawned by hololithic armor use your Needler rifle. They apply a damage over time effect. The problem is the damage over time effect they deals no damage, but if I've hit with the Needle Blast, their 0 damage over time effect eliminates the Needle Blast entirely. So having them is actually a DPS loss if I'm trying to use the poison. It's like, oh my god. It's so frustrating. And it also means that if I'm using this, if I Needle Blast them and then left click, I lose the Needle Blast dot as well. If I use the right click, I lose the Needle Blast dot. So I always have to use this last thing before switching. It is very, very frustrating. And this will tie substantially into the suggestions that I make in the next section.
Eradicated.
All right, there's a nice Ogrin, so we can show off the problem with the... Come on, go away, chaps. I just want to quickly show off with this Ogrin. All right, so here you have an Ogrin. Come on over here, friend. So what I'm going to do first, let's test this needle blast. So actually no, let's use the pervasive shot. This guy doesn't have armor, but if I just tag him with this, it'll deal 237, tick for 130, put some vulnerabilities on him. It's now ticking for 120. What? I've just applied vulnerability. Why has the damage of... I don't know what's going on there, but something strange is certainly going on with the way these effects are calculated. If, on the other hand, I do this the other way around, where I do this first and then apply a bleed, this is what happens. So I just stack some vulnerabilities, hit him with the bleed. The base is 622, and then the tick instantly kills him. So it's a very frustrating way to operate the build. And then finally, you might be wondering, how does this do versus single targets? Well, the answer is it does absolutely fine, because stacked vulnerabilities are absolutely ridiculous. So here's a depraved champion. So you just go like this. 1, 2, 3. Stacked, and he's gone. You saw that 900 and something tick killing him. So yeah, the short answer is, with this build, it sort of works, but only because vulnerability is ridiculous. The damage over time effects themselves are very, very weak. So now I'm going to talk about what I think should be done in order to fix the problems with damage. Because I feel like I've taken this build as far as you can possibly take a damage over time build. I'm dealing all 3 damage over time effects. I'm using the most powerful relic mod for it. I'm stacking as much vulnerability as possible. I've used every conceivable multiplier that I can get, including surprise. I've even taken crit or digi-weapons in order to get cooldown resets on this, and in order to increase the proc rate of the vulnerability on crit from the physical tree on this. I'm doing almost whatever I can to increase my damage over time effects. So here are my suggestions. First, the active dot should always be the largest current dot that you have applied to them, not the most recent. This seems to be obviously the case. If that isn't going to be changed, then at the bare minimum, dots that deal 0 damage, for example, from the clones, should not count as dots. They shouldn't exist, and they certainly shouldn't be able to override an actual damaging dot that I've put on. Another required change is that obviously the overheat, 0 overheat burn node needs to be fixed. I don't know if it's intended that crits don't scale the dots that they cause. If that is the way it's intended to work, then that's fine. Change the other systems to make dots better. If it isn't intended that they work that way, then that needs to be fixed, because it's the single biggest damage boost you could possibly get, given how powerful crits are and various other things. That's like a required change if that's broken. This is also, I think, is a required change. Damage over time effects should check how vulnerable the enemy is per tick, rather than snapshotting at the beginning. So this means that I could, for example, as a pattern, apply my bleed on my burn, and then ramp the needler toxin to make the enemy more vulnerable to those ticks as they go. So it's not the case that I'm applying vulnerability and then dumping all my dots on them to kill them at the end. Yeah, this assassin armor bonus that I'm wearing needs to work with the sniper shot tag, because the sniper shot literally says it adds a damage over time tag to my attack. I'm meeting all the requirements. It should work. The cooldown on my sniper shots are both over 5.3. That's what causes the thing to proc. I know that should work. Attrition feedback needs to be improved. I mean, I think it's a requirement. I don't think there's any reason that anyone would ever take it otherwise. I can't think of any conceivable reason to take it. 10 HP per tick is just not good enough. If you're a Crusader, it might be 12 or 14 HP per tick. It's garbage. There's a problem. I'm actually going to leave this. There's a problem in the skill tree too. In the damage over time tree, it lists something called corrosion damage. Your corrosion damage deals 50% increased damage versus armored targets. I don't know what this means. What is corrosion damage? Is corrosion poison and bleed? Is corrosion all damage over time effect? If it's damage over time, change that to corrosion. Just whatever that node is. This node. Whatever this node is, just clarify what it is. It also seems to me the case that if a skill like this one on the Exitus is both armor breaking and damage over time brackets bleeding, it should be the case that the damage over time effect it applies is also armor breaking, or at least is applied at the value thing. The one way to do this would be to make dot ticks immune to armor effects. They are definitely affected by armor at the moment, and that's incredibly frustrating. So for example, on a Dreadnought, I shot it with this bleeding shot for 200 and something, and had the dot ticks of 45, which is clearly way lower than the usual half damage ratio that I get. And here are what I think of as being my suggested changes, what I would want to see changed. I don't think these are requirements, but what would be nice? It would be nice if there were dots that weren't related to initial hit damage. As things currently stand, it's so much easier to scale initial hit damage. It's so much more rewarding. If I kill things instantly, then they can't hurt me. Damage over time inherently involves a higher risk. I should be rewarded for that. The only bonus I get from this at the moment is that enemies take 20% or deal 20% reduced damage from my poison. Dots which are not related to initial hit, that'd be cool. Possibly add some way for dots to stack. The fact that dots don't stack at all is really silly. It's doubly silly that if you look at the needler rifle, this has a stacking on it, a stacking needler toxin, but the toxin stacks, the poison doesn't. The distinction between the toxin and the poison here is a fine and interesting one. It might make sense for possibly, for example, poison to stack, the others not to. You could change the base damage of those or something. It would be nice if there were mechanics that allow you to sacrifice initial hit damage or crit chance for bigger dots. An obvious thing here could be a perk. Something like your initial hits are reduced by half, but the damage over time effect caused and multiplied by 4. It would be nice if there was some way to get armor breaking dots, maybe give damage over time effects armor penetration inherently, or a perk which gives dots better armor penetration. Starting to deal with armor. Dots should be good versus armor, it's that kind of thing. They're garbage versus armor. It'd be nice if there were effects that proc on damage over time kill. If I want to heal myself, there are tons of ways for me to heal myself. Using hit skills, HP on hit, 10% of HP on single target one-shots, that kind of thing. Melee kills, wherever it is, there's some health on melee kill and stuff like that. Yeah, melee kills for 20 HP. There's nothing like that for damage over time. So you're inherently at a huge disadvantage because you aren't one-shotting things. You're now at an even bigger disadvantage because you can't use any of the healing mechanics, or many of the healing mechanics. Most of them are gone. If you're not running crit, or at least I'm not running much crit, because the crit in this build is purely a support stat to reset cooldowns, then I have problems with not being able to use the incredibly good brackets overpowered 20% Rosarius on crit armor bonus. There aren't effects that happen on crit. Like, I've had to take digi weapons and crit chance to get the cooldown reduction from cerebral feedback, because otherwise, in order to use this armor bonus, which is presumably the intended way that you go with damage over time skills, I have to make all my cooldowns over 5 seconds long, which means it feels incredibly clunky if I don't have cooldown reduction of some description. So cerebral feedback is a necessity. And also I need some crit in order to get this because free vulnerability is so good. Okay, finally, some possible changes that might really help. Some way to proliferate damage over time effects. Or better ways to apply them in areas. One obvious example, so if you look at things like plasma pistols have enemies explode on kill, that kind of thing. There isn't an obvious way for me to get AoE other than the needle toxin and the extra shots here. An example of a perk that I thought of would be something like airborne toxins. Active poison damage over time effects are spread to a nearby enemy when an enemy dies with a poison effect active on them with the duration that was left. So you get both the bonus for scaling poison duration, and there's a reason to apply really big poisons. I also think there should be some kind of reward for players for investing heavily in dot duration, even if it isn't necessarily the case. This is something I'm not sure about. I would be interested in testing this, but it looks like dot duration doesn't do anything unless you have enough dot duration to get an actual full tick. So I have 20% dot duration or something currently on my gear. Where is it? Yeah, 8.9 there. And a bit over here. Yeah, 10% dot duration here. I don't get an extra tick on my poison. And that makes me think that what's actually happening is that because the game only ticks once every second, it only actually gives you a tick if you meet the whole second thing. If that's the case, it should be fixed. One interesting thing that you could do here as another possible change is make dots tick more often. That would be an indirect way of buffing attrition feedback. All right, thanks for listening to my extremely long and boring rant about damage over time effects. I can't think of any other way to make damage over time effects good in this game. Every other way of scaling them seems to me you automatically get so much upfront damage that you're just like, why even bother with the damage over time effects? The number of small irritating bugs and mechanical strangenesses with how dots work is ridiculous. Like almost every single thing I've tried has been either complicated or failed. But yeah, so I hope this helps. I have sacrificed my time and energy to produce this fucking god-awful build. I hope this helps the rest of you, and good luck. Oh yeah, and add something for classes that aren't assassins, because the fact that I think only assassins get this armor bonus means that other classes can't even remotely get that much. Alright, good luck chaps, and goodbye.